So, Ali, we've come to a conclusion at this point about diagnosis. Can you sum up and put together for us some basic overall concepts that you'd like the audience or docs to take with them as they go about this process of diagnosis for an endodontic lesion?
Absolutely. I think the first and foremost lesson to learn is that diagnosis is a process, that our goal is to capture information as systematically as possible so we don't miss any information from the patient throughout a oral interview, an interviewing of the patient through the first 3-4 steps. And then after we've had enough information about what they're subjectively feeling and that we can assess that, its urgency, its quality, nature, location, all of those things, take that information, combine it with the clinical tests that we then run with the extraoral and intraoral and with the radiographic test, and if required, any other tests, and superimpose basically those two pieces of information and almost like a hologram, come up with a grand kind of a theory of diagnosis which explains the symptoms that they're seeing us for. And that is really the essence of diagnosis. It's kind of like a puzzle. You have little pieces that you put together. Then you use your knowledge base, which is what we talked about in the early part of the course, with an understanding of the histology and the physiology of the system that you're dealing with, and see where these puzzles in your knowledge base come together and form a pattern that represents the pathology that the patient is experiencing. And then that becomes your differential diagnosis. We talked about differential diagnosis being different than regular diagnosis because in this case, definitive diagnosis, because in endodontics we don't have access to histological samples from the site, which is basically the goal of our endodontic therapy, to define pulpal diagnosis and apical diagnosis. And we talked about the legal aspect of that nowadays, that you need to have, before you do any treatment endodontically on any tooth, you need to have clearly defined pulpal and apical diagnoses for the given tooth at hand, so that you can, that should be documented basically. And lastly, because this process can be lengthy at times, it's important that we can. We all know that nobody has enough time nowadays, right? I mean, you're running between 3 or 4 different operatories. You got a bunch of patients here. It's important to spend the time and really train your assistants so that they can capture at least a lot of the information from the patient during the patient interview portion of this process, and then maybe do some of the simpler patient examination parts. And then they will come to you, and they, most of the time after you have enough training with your assistant, they will be able to even interpret the radiograph and give you a general overall information. That's basically what the hospitals, the residents do for the attendings when they walk into the room. They just kind of filter the information, because if you sit and talk to the patient for a while, it could go into a lot of different places. And this helps you focus the information and get it to the most useful parts that are important to you. That doesn't mean you don't listen to the patient, because it's a critical part of the patient interview is to really listen to the patient. But if your time is limited, your assistants should be able to be trained to listen to it, which means that they should all be watching and listening to this course as well, so that they can have the information that is required in order for them to make that diagnosis or help you make that final definitive diagnosis. That's really critical.
I get the sense, my takeaway from this, and we've spent this time, focusing specifically on diagnosis, coming up with a definitive endodontic diagnosis, is that if the puzzle pieces don't fit together, don't make them fit together.
Yes.
Okay? You got to, in other words, let it be a key influencer in terms of backing off and having you be aware that although you are trying to make a diagnosis and do everything that's right for the patient, that you should not be forced into a spot where you feel that you must make a final diagnosis.
Absolutely. Ultimately, that's another very important point to take home, is that your diagnosis and your treatment is your responsibility. Right. Your responsibility for what happens. You are responsible for what happens. So it's important not to get pressured by deadlines, people that are flying to different places, patients that are impatient. Ultimately, if you decide to do treatment, it's your responsibility, and no one is going to accept any excuses from you.
I mean, if somebody says the patient made me do it, that
exactly.
doesn't work.
It doesn't usually fly very well in a court of law. The patient wanted me to do the wrong tooth. Not a very good defense system. So basically what we're trying to communicate with you is that you need to be fairly confident about your diagnosis, pulpal and periapical, before you start to do treatment. And that, I think, should be the driving lesson that people can take home with them. So, Dennis, we've started from the 7-step process. We've done everything, but seems like after all of this time, we now only have the diagnosis.
Right.
Now what?
Well, we're going to focus on emergency treatment and come back and then go into definitive treatment in terms of technique and technology and new concepts of how to carry out that process more efficiently. So we thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And for Real Dental, I'm Ali Nasseh.
And I'm Dennis Brave.
And we hope you found this information helpful.